All right, good morning everyone, and welcome to this webinar from 3Grow, Driving End User Adoption with Microsoft Teams. During the session, we will be going through some slides and also through some demonstrations. And of course, there will be time for questions and answers as well. So if you're not familiar with 3Grow, just to give you a bit of background just briefly, we are a Microsoft 365 specialist training organization based in Australia, running training courses not only in Australia, but also New Zealand and Southeast Asia, such as Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, etc. Of course, at the moment, the majority of our training is delivered remotely due to the current travel restrictions imposed by the pandemic. But normally we are delivering training all over the region in all aspects of Microsoft 365, such as, of course, SharePoint and Teams, Power Apps, Power Automate, Power BI, additional tools such as Live Tiles, the Nintex suite of products as well. And if you're not familiar with me, brief bit of background on me. So I'm Managing Director of 3Grow, based here in sunny Loxdown, Melbourne. I've been running training courses for over 17 years now, 18 years in January it'll be. The last 12 or 13 of those years have been spent specializing in initially SharePoint, and then once Office 365 came along, and then now kind of rebranded as Microsoft 365, specializing in those tools as well. So during the session, we'll be talking about, of course, the focus is going to be on Microsoft Teams. However, we will be talking about some kind of theory-based discussions, which are more generic, based around user adoption of tools in general. So we'll talk about selecting the best tools for the job, identifying the various different roles, including stakeholders, champions, and mentors. Some tips on planning the rollout of whatever tools you deem appropriate. We'll talk about the Teams versus SharePoint and where they fit in with your end user engagement plan. Of course, training is very important within any user adoption kind of scenario. So we will, of course, be mentioning that as well. And also, finally, performing follow-ups. So these are the steps we should be taking to ensure successful adoption of the tools. So when it comes to selecting the right tools for the job, the first point is to ensure that discovery takes place. Have a look at how organizations are, or how the members of your organization are working, what they need to achieve, and therefore determine which tools best suit those purposes. When doing so, we determine which tools provide the appropriate benefits to the organization, but not only the organization, but also the individual. Any organization, there's going to be frustrations in the way that people work at the moment. So for example, maybe people are finding it very difficult to find information because the documents are currently stored on a very convoluted kind of folder structure on network drives with 28 layers deep of folders and so on. And they're finding it very difficult to locate information. Not only that, but they're finding that there's multiple copies of what's supposed to be the same document, but there's differences between them and so on. So when going through this process, especially when it comes to determining the best tool for the job as far as the benefits to the organization, benefits to the individual, it's worth addressing the various different categories of users that exist within an organization. So what I've done is I've highlighted some examples of those. So they may fit into the categories of stakeholders, champions, and mentors. Stakeholders are the people that are going to be affected by whatever implementation we put forward. Champions are key people when it comes to kind of singing the praises or pushing the tools onto the users and ensuring that that people have that kind of positive outlook on those tools from the beginning. That's very important when, of course, ensuring that that you're getting people's buy-in. Mentors are people dotted, champions and mentors, I would suggest, to people that are dotted throughout the organization that are able to provide kind of coaching and training at a more individual level to the members within their teams. Now, not all of those roles require the same level of input and output throughout the implementation of and adoption of the tools. So they're the main roles, and there's different categories of users that may fall into any of those roles. So the first category of people is what I like to refer to as the yes people. So the manager would say, for example, this is how we're now going to be working as a team. These are the tools we're using. These are the processes that we're following. And the employee just says, yes, okay. So they are probably the easiest people to deal with because they simply just accept whatever the manager puts forward. However, are these people the most valuable to the organization? I would suggest probably not. The reason being that they don't challenge the reasoning behind it. So that leads on to the challenger. So the manager says, this is how we're now going to do it. The employee says, well, why? What are the benefits to the company? Why is the organization doing this? So those people are great because those people generally have the best interests of the organization in mind. And maybe it makes you, if you're in a senior position, you are the one that is driving this change. Maybe it triggers you into thinking, okay, well, that's a good point. Why are we doing this? Are we doing it because other people are doing it? Are we doing it because there's going to be a benefit to the organization? Is there going to be a benefit to the individuals? Is it going to make the organization's processes more efficient? If not, if it's maybe you're just kind of jumping on a bandwagon that other people are jumping on as far as functionality and tools are concerned, but it may not necessarily be the right fit for you. The challengers generally make good mentors and champions as well, because they're the ones that have more of a vested interest in ensuring that that the adoption takes place. We've then got the 9-to-5er. So they're not too bothered about the benefit to the organization necessarily. All they want to know is, how is it going to benefit me? How is it going to make my life easier? They often require a bit of additional attention. I certainly wouldn't kind of pander to the 9-to-5ers. They're the kind of people that want to just turn up, do their job, get it done in the easiest way possible. And then at 5 o'clock, they don't think about the organization. They don't think about work. They just want to get in, do their job, earn their money and go home. And there's nothing at all wrong with that. But of course, we need to know that, understand that those people do exist within organizations. So anything we can do to make their life easier and therefore get their buy-in and encourage their adoption is certainly good. But and should certainly be considered. However, so we shouldn't be kind of pandering to people too much, and especially when it comes to the last category, which is the old dog, as in you can't teach an old dog new tricks. So these are the people that don't want to learn something new. They've been doing it this way for many, many years. Why can't we just carry on doing it this way? It worked. Why can't we just carry on? Well, horses and carts worked, but that doesn't mean they're the most efficient way of getting around now. So if all the drivers in a taxi company decided that they didn't want to learn how to drive these newfangled cars that the taxi company owner had already purchased, then if the taxi company owner panders to those people and says, okay, well, don't worry about the money I've wasted on these cars. You just carry on using those horses and carts. Of course, all the other taxi companies are going to be getting all the business because they can get people from A to B much, much quicker. So these are the people that are a lot more difficult to win over. So we need to bear those people in mind. And often, as goes by the name of that category of people, the old dogs, the chances are they've probably not got that long left in the workplace anyway before they retire. So again, getting their buy-in as much as we can, and kind of appeasing them to a degree until they kind of retire. So a lot of these people are not too keen on adopting technology or modern business practices. Unfortunately, they often find themselves in a senior position within the organization, which may come from length of service as opposed to merit, and therefore they can be quite obstructive when trying to implement modern working practices. So when it comes to planning the rollout, it's very important that your champions, your business analysts, your mentors have all had the appropriate level of training, because they need to be able to convey the benefits of the tools that you're implementing. And also, of course, provide that coaching to the people within the business. It's also very important to avoid IT-centric implementations. So IT departments shouldn't be determining which tools should be used for what, how you should use those tools. The business knows best. It all, as we talk about on our SharePoint training courses, things like the role of a site owner shouldn't be an IT person. An IT person shouldn't be building standardized site templates for all the business units to use, because the IT department don't know how each of the individual business units work. They don't know what information they need to store, how they need to store it, how they need to access it, who needs what permissions. IT don't know that. It's not their job to know that. That's the role of the business users. So the same goes for site ownership in SharePoint, building apps and workflows in Power Apps and Power Automate. That should be done by business users rather than IT people. That's why we have these this modern kind of Power Platform to provide tools for what these days known as those citizen developers. So people, people that have had an appropriate level of training and are able to build those sites, those workflows, those apps for the benefits of their business. So certainly pushing the implementation and the rollout from a business perspective is likely to yield far more successful results. So determining deployment tiers and stages. So when it comes to rolling out, let's say SharePoint or Teams, for example, think about how you're going to roll that out. So is there an area of your organization that is particularly excited about the new tools? Or is there an area of your organization, a team or a department, that are going to receive an immediate benefit, that quick win from having implemented these tools, and could be used as a showcase for the rest of the organization to show the benefits of implementing these tools? So identifying things based on our teams or areas of your organization based on a priority or something like that is certainly going to help as well. Setting expectations is very important. So identifying, okay, up to this point, this team, and this team will have their SharePoint sites, and their champions from each of those teams will have had the appropriate training. Then it'll be rolled out to this team, and then at this point the intranet will be implemented, and so on. So having those dates and timelines are very important in order to set those expectations. The other important point is that, as with anything, implementing something new, people need to understand that there will be that slight dip in efficiency when the tool is first implemented. So, for example, there's going to be that learning curve. So maybe the taxi company has to take people away from off the roads for a while they actually teach them to drive these cars. And therefore there's going to be a dip in efficiency while people kind of get to know the ropes of the new tools. But it's certainly, as long as everything else about the implementation is and the rollout has been planned appropriately and people have had the appropriate training, then that dip in efficiency is an investment, because that time that's been lost during that learning curve is going to be you get that back many times over throughout the duration of once the implementation is up and running. So moving on to the more specific element of the discussion, which is the tools in question being Teams and SharePoint. So it's a question I often ask people, or sorry, I hear people asking, is should we use Teams or should we use SharePoint? Now, it's not a question of using one or the other. They each play their role. I was talking to a customer about a custom training rollout for some of their staff, and they wanted a customized Teams session. And within our standard Microsoft Teams training outline, they spotted the element about SharePoint, and they said, "Oh, we don't need to cover SharePoint." I said, "Oh, you're only using Teams for the audio calls, instant messenger, and that kind of stuff, and online meetings." "Oh no, we're using it for collaboration as well." So I said, "Oh, in that case, you really need to know about a little bit about SharePoint as well." "Oh no, but we're not using SharePoint, we're using Teams." And they just had no idea that every team within Microsoft Teams has a SharePoint site sitting behind it. So if you are using Teams collaborative functionality, so working as a team within Teams, as opposed to the functionality that was used that replaces Skype for Business, such as audio calls, online meetings, and so on. If you are using that collaborative functionality of Teams, you are using SharePoint. The files you're uploading and working in are sitting in a SharePoint site behind the scenes. So you cannot use the collaborative features of Teams without using SharePoint, even if you don't see it happening. While we're here, a bit of a top tip just thrown in there, which is ensuring a level of familiarity. So we talked about those different categories of people that we need to kind of get on board. Some of them are easy to get on board. Some of them are not so easy. So for example, the old dogs and the 9-to-5ers, we need to ensure there's a level of familiarity. Now, the reason that top tip is thrown onto this slide is because it's not so easy to achieve that level of familiarity and therefore get that buy-in by using only Teams as it comes out of the box. So for example, what we're talking about is the way that we structure files and ensuring that that people are able to follow a similar process from what they followed within whatever you're moving from as far as document management is concerned, such as file shares or network drives or something like that. So that certainly fits in with how we're going to roll Teams out, or whether we whether we manage the information in SharePoint and pull it through into Teams that way, and so on. And it's quite a common mistake I see a lot of organizations making, is they go for a Teams first approach as opposed to a SharePoint first approach. So when it comes to making that decision between whether you actually need Teams or not, or whether SharePoint on its own will suffice, that comes into that is based around a discussion of, do I need a Microsoft 365 group, previously known as Office 365 groups, going through a bit of a rebrand at the moment, as we said. So there are two types of team sites. The vast majority of team sites that people will be using will be group connected team sites. The reason that they are the most common is because they are the only option that we get when creating a site from SharePoint Home. So just to explain what I mean by that, if I just to share my desktop for a moment, here in Microsoft 365 on SharePoint Home, we have the option up here in the top left-hand corner to create a site. Now, when we choose to create a site, we only get two options. Those options are a team site with an Office 365 group, aka Microsoft 365 group, or a communication site. So even if we don't actually need the Office 365 group, the Microsoft 365 group, we end up with one anyway because there's no option to create a team site without one. The only way to create a team site without an Office 365 group, a Microsoft 365 group attached, is to do that through the admin center, which is therefore only possible by the IT admins. So let's go back to the slides, bear with me. And now my slides disappeared. Give me a second. So with a Microsoft 365 group, they're certainly beneficial in the sense that with every Microsoft 365 group, we get a shared mailbox, a shared calendar, we get that Outlook-based threaded conversation. We get that single email address assigned to that group, which can be used almost like a distribution list. So it's like a hybrid of all of these things, shared mailbox, shared calendar, and so on. We also get a means of sharing files. So of course, what Microsoft use as the, well, what do Microsoft use? What's their key tool when it comes to sharing files amongst a collection of people? Answers in the chat message window, please. What is the tool that Microsoft provides through Microsoft 365 that allows us to share files with a collection of people? I was waiting for someone to say OneDrive. Absolutely not. SharePoint. Why is OneDrive not, what is OneDrive used for if it's not used for sharing files amongst a group of people? Yes, it's personal. So OneDrive is for personal content. OneDrive is not the tools that is not the tool we should be using to share files with a group of people. That's what SharePoint is for. That's what SharePoint's always been for. So yes, you can share files from your OneDrive, but OneDrive shouldn't be where we're sharing files with a team of people or a group of people. If you imagine that every SharePoint site is there to store information relating to a particular subject or topic, such as a team, a department, or a project, for example. So the subject of the content of that site is, and therefore the libraries and lists within that site is that team, that department or project. The subject of your OneDrive, and therefore what should be going in your OneDrive, is you. You are the subject of your OneDrive. Therefore, your OneDrive should contain simply files relating to you that you may want to share with other people. Maybe they're something like annual appraisal documents. You collate your appraisal documents and you can then share those with your manager from the OneDrive. You are the subject of those files, therefore they sit within your OneDrive. Maybe it's where you store your expenses claims, where you collate that before you then submit them to finance or something along those lines. Maybe you keep a copy of your resume in there for when you're applying for internal positions and so on. So every Office 365 group comes with a SharePoint site attached because that's the tool that Microsoft provides to allow us to share files amongst a collection of people. So a group connected site, because of the nature of that functionality we get, such as that shared mailbox, the shared calendar, and that single email address assigned to that group and so on, group connected sites are really only recommended for small scale collaboration, up to say 12 to 15 people. So if you imagine that I've seen people create Office 365 group connected sites for teams of 50 or 60 people. That means there's 50 or 60 people with access to that shared mailbox, that shared calendar, accessing or communicating via that kind of Outlook-based threaded chat. Now, in my opinion, that's going to be very messy with such a large number of people accessing that, that shared calendar, shared mailbox, and so on. So what I would generally suggest is that you have smaller group connected sites for sub teams within the larger team or department. What we can then do is we could have a non-group connected site for the main team or department site. Now, we don't need, let's say, the whole of the finance department collaborating through Teams as one. We don't need the whole finance department with access to the same shared mailbox, the same shared calendar. Bear in mind that your finance department may consist of dozens and dozens of people in larger organizations. That's just going to be very messy. So what I'd suggest is that we have a non-group connected finance site. That would then act as a hub, and then you'd have things like payroll, accounts payable, accounts receivable, and so on as group connected sites. They can then be connected to the main finance hub. So each of the teams within the finance department have got their own specific collaborative area, and so on. And of course, what a group connected site allows is that integration with Microsoft Teams. You can only have a team in Teams if you have a group connected SharePoint site. And again, this is that confusion that people often have is we're not using SharePoint, we're using Teams. Well, if you have a team in Teams, then you have a SharePoint site and you have an Office 365 group connected to that site. So you cannot have a site without a group. You cannot have a group without a site. You can have a team site with no group. Not all team sites need a group, but all groups need a team site. So if there is an Office 365 group, sorry, Microsoft 365 group, then there is a SharePoint site attached to it. However, we can have a site with no group attached because maybe we don't need a shared mailbox, we don't need a shared calendar, we don't need that single email address assigned to that collection of people. In that case, we don't need a group. The downside is that we can't just create those ourselves as business users. That has to be something that's requested from IT. But again, processes can be set up for that. You could have a site request form, which might be a custom list. It could be a Power App, could be a basic form in Microsoft Forms, that when people submit, they answer appropriate questions, that gets submitted, and a Power Automate workflow can then determine, based on the responses to the questions in the form, which is the best possible solution, what's the ideal site type in that instance. Is it communication site, team site with a group, team site without a group, and so on. And then once that can then provide that, the workflow can then send an email to IT to say, Russ has requested a site for these purposes. Based on his answers, we think a group connected team site is the best option. Is it okay to create one? IT just say yes or no. If they say no, they can suggest an alternative. Either way, the workflow does all the donkey work. I request a site, IT approve it or suggest an alternative. The workflow creates the site, I get my site, off we go. So putting things like that in place are really handy because it means that you can decide who is allowed to request sites. Some people, their requests might be automatically approved. Some people, it might need to go through IT. So you can build all these conditional elements into it and streamline the process of site creation rather than simply turning off the ability for people to create sites through SharePoint Home, which means that no one can create sites, or turn it on, which means everyone can create sites. And if everyone can create sites, it can get very messy and get that sprawl and no one really knows where anything is. So just addressing a question from Neville, what's the better option for external collaboration, in my opinion? So I would suggest that it depends on the scenario. Neville, do you have a specific scenario in mind? Is it collaboration just on a single file? Does that file already exist somewhere? Is it already in a SharePoint site? Is it just one file? Is it a collection of files? All of these things will affect.
Might be easier if I explain in.
That's okay. Go ahead.
So we, as you know, we're probably not 100% near our final rollout anyway, but we've got a couple of departments that are starting to use the functionality. So OneDrive, and they're sort of ready to get into Teams.
Yep.
But predominantly what they're using it for at the moment is for external collaboration, probably 40% of what they're doing. And it's all been done and driven out of OneDrive at the moment. But they're starting to ask questions about, can we get external users into our Teams and our Teams channels, or should we use SharePoint? Those types of questions. And I'm still a little bit torn as to which is the best option, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the nature of the collaboration. Are they simply working on a collection of files, and it's simply a case of editing those files, or do they also need those conversations and that chat that we get through Teams? Do the external parties need the other benefits of Teams, such as the ability to pull information from elsewhere to display as additional tabs within the channels and things like that? So if it's a case of I just need to share these files with an external party so that we can edit them together, instead of course, emailing backwards and forwards, because as a general rule, we should absolutely never be sending file attachments internally. There's absolutely no need and no excuse for it. Even externally, it's very, very rare that I would ever send an attachment to an external party. If it's, for example, I need to provide them with the file, it's not going to change, it's just going to be read only. Here's this file, you need to read this, then that's not so bad. But if I was going through a custom training rollout and we want to produce some custom training outlines that require input from me and from the customer, there's no way I would be emailing those backwards and forwards, because of course it's just so difficult to manage. And there's multiple copies of that file going to be floating around in my inbox, in my sent items, and so on. So therefore, I would certainly share those through SharePoint. So the point is, where do the files exist at the moment? Is it my file that I want to share with an external party, or is it the Teams file that I want to share with an external party? That's the main question to ask, I guess.
Yeah, fair enough. I think at the moment they're usually probably more project-driven sort of documents, like they might be related to a job that we've tendered out, say, for example, and they just want to collaborate with a contractor, those types of things.
Yeah, so what I'd suggest is that those files should exist in a site dedicated to that project in the first place. So you'd normally have a group connected SharePoint site with or without Teams. Teams is that optional element on the side. You can still store and share and collaborate without Teams. SharePoint's been managing that perfectly well for the last 18 years. So Teams is a nice additional element as that kind of collaborative layer, but certainly there should definitely be a SharePoint site dedicated to that project in the first place. That type of information should never be in anyone's OneDrive, because it's not their files, it's not their information, it's the Teams, it's the project. Does that make sense?
Yep, sure.
Wonderful. The slight risk, I guess, is that by default, a group connected site does have external sharing enabled by default, which is fine until you realize that by default, everyone in the team, every member of the team, every member of the group is is able to share by default, not only share individual files, but also share the whole site. So that's something to definitely be aware of when it comes to external sharing, because you don't know if you've got a site for your project, you don't want to, and that's predominantly for the vast majority of that is only of internal use. What people often do is say, well, we can't share that externally. So what I'll do is I'll copy that file into my OneDrive and I'll share it from there. And that's because external sharing may not be enabled on the site itself. And that's maybe why people end up going for the OneDrive approach. I don't agree that they should be, but if that's their only option, then what else are they going to do? Maybe their IT department simply don't allow them. Maybe the organizational policies don't allow content from SharePoint sites to be shared externally. If IT or if your organization simply refuse to allow you to share external to share files externally at all from SharePoint, then OneDrive may be the only option. It's not a good option, but it's the only option. So what you can do in that instance is, if you are forced into doing that, is you could set up a folder in OneDrive that you can share with the external parties, but then use a Power Automate workflow to ensure that those files are replicated in a particular folder in your SharePoint site. So if a change is made in SharePoint, it will then update the equivalent file within OneDrive and vice versa between OneDrive and that folder. That will save that risk of those files being out of sync. So ideally, people should have been provided with the appropriate level of training. Is there a Power Automate template for that? Jess, no, there's not, but not that I'm aware of. I don't tend to use the templates so much. Certainly something like that. It's so simple to set up that I personally wouldn't have thought about using a template personally for that. But bear in mind, I've been using Power Automate for a long time, so therefore I tend to just go in from scratch when creating most of my workflows. But it's a case of you'd create two workflows, one to say when something is created or edited in OneDrive, it replicates that change within SharePoint, and another workflow to go the opposite way. So you have two workflows to keep those two locations in sync. So just keep an eye on the comments and so on as well. So our ICT, this is from Anne Lazaro, our ICT have disabled external sharing for OneDrive. We can only have external sharing on sites if we specifically request this at the time of site creation. So that's probably a good thing. I mean, OneDrive is generally supposed to be for your personal information, personal but work related still information. So removing that ability to share externally isn't necessarily a bad thing. In my opinion, the reason that IT disable external sharing as a blanket rule is because they don't trust people to share appropriately. The reason they don't trust people to share appropriately is not because they think those people are malicious. It's not that they think those people are trying to share sensitive information for nefarious reasons with external parties. It's because they don't trust people. They don't trust people's knowledge. People may accidentally share stuff. If your site owners, your group owners, your SharePoint champions throughout the organization have had the appropriate level of training, then there's no real risk. If you've got policies in place to say this is how we should use the tools, and if you've got governance in place to say this is what we should use for what, and people have got the relevant knowledge, then there really is minimal risk. But the problem is a lot of organizations, they rather than providing training, they simply restrict people's functionality because of that lack of trust and that lack of knowledge. But that of course means that you don't have access to the tools that would benefit you and that would make you more efficient because that training hasn't been provided. So it can be very frustrating, knowing that so many organizations are missing out on a lot of fantastic functionality purely because they're not, you know, they don't trust them to use that functionality, maybe primarily because of a lack of knowledge. All right, so I think that pretty much covers most of the questions that have just popped in at that point. Oh, a question coming in. So Stephen just says, especially when they fall back to adding a file to an email, then losing all control. Exactly. So people are resorting to poor practices because they've not been provided with the functionality that they need. Lauren says, what would you recommend for teams management if we still want people to be able to create their own teams? IT are too small to manage this for the whole company. So again, if people have been provided with the appropriate training, then I don't see the problem with people creating their own teams. What I would suggest is, we talked about the fact that on SharePoint Home, we have the ability to create, we have the ability to turn off the create site option. Now, by default, through SharePoint, through the SharePoint Admin Center, that's simply turned on or it's turned off. So it's on for everyone or off for everyone. Certainly in larger organizations, that may well be set to off because you don't want people creating sites left, right, and center, because you'll end up with such a mess. And I was talking to a friend about this yesterday. He was at a university where they had something like 800 sites in existence. They deleted 400 of them and no one batted an eyelid because no one even was using them. No one noticed that those sites had gone. So the problem is that people had been given the option to be able to create sites, or create a team, and they didn't really know what it was. They thought, oh, I wonder what this does. Give it a click. Oh, that's what it does. And then they just left this site sitting there doing nothing. So yeah, these things can easily happen. So worth pointing out that what your IT department can do is they can create an Active Directory security group. They can add certain people to that group. Maybe people are added to that group once they've had an appropriate level of training, once they've signed a document which is their acceptance of the organizational policies around creating sites, creating teams, and agreement of the governance document. Once people go through that process, they can be added to an Active Directory security group. And what your IT department can do is, just using some PowerShell commands, they can present the create site option there on SharePoint Home. They can present that only to the people in that Active Directory security group. So there is actually a link I posted on the 3Grow Yammer network a long time ago that I'll see if I can dig that out, because there's or you can Google it yourselves. There is a way of being able to do that. So IT can create an Active Directory security group and assign permissions to that security group. Assign the create site option only to members of that group. And you can have people go through a process before they can be added to that group, so that you have more control over who is able to do that. Another question from Lauren was about using Teams and adding externals versus setting up a dedicated SharePoint site. So again, I think it just comes down to the level of control that you want, and also the amount of content that you may well be sharing, along with what functionality do the external people need. As we were saying in regard to someone else's question earlier, do the external people need access to the chat, the conversations within the channels of Teams? Do they need those benefits of Teams? Or is it simply a case of, do they need to collaborate on some documents together? If it's just a case of collaborating on documents, there's no real need to add them to Teams. They can be given access directly to the SharePoint site. So in that instance, you share the site with them. You don't add them to the group that's connected to the site. So we'll see that option in a few moments when we go into a demo. So we don't add them to the Microsoft 365 group that represents the team because they're not part of the team.